Still, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on several areas of inquiry linked by an interest in spatial demography, or more broadly, the connections between people and places. Neighborhoods play a central role in his research and is a theme that unifies many of his projects. He examines neighborhood inequality across multiple ecological dimensions, including residential mobility, health, environmental, economic, education, and crime. The rationale driving this comprehensive and transdisciplinary approach is the perspective that neighborhoods are shaped by multiple ecological factors and in turn shape multiple outcomes. Thank you for being here. We're excited for this.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending my talk today, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my work this afternoon. I was a graduate of the program back in 2013, and a lot has changed as I came through campus. So it's nice to be back on campus. It's nice to see a lot of new faces as well as a lot of familiar ones as well. And I'm very honored to be christening the brown bag in the new area space. So thank you for that. And the title of my talk today is A Demographic Bridge to Diversity, Segregation, and Diversity of Millennial Young Adult Neighborhoods in U.S. metropolitan areas. This is a project in collaboration with Jennifer Candipan, who's an assistant professor at Brown University. And all the results I'll be presenting today are all preliminary. So any feedback, any questions, any reactions to push this study forward is very much welcome and appreciated. So in this paper, we compare residential segregation levels of young adults across generations. And Norman Ryder, in his seminal piece, The Cohort as a Concept in the Study of Social Change, really established this concept or this idea of a generation as an important unit of analysis for studying societal transformations. And so he defines a generation as a cohort of individuals who are born in the same general time period. Now, Ryder's concept is distinctive because he proposes that age is not the only necessary factor that links people into a generational category. Instead, it is also the events that occur at various critical points in the group's lifetime that forms a generation and defines their unique core values and behaviors. And therefore, the transition from one generation to another is often characterized by major structural societal transformations, and the effects of these transformations are persistent over time. Now, Ryder emphasizes in particular in this paper that it is critical events that occur during certain ages during a life course that are actually important vehicles for incurring social change. In particular, he focuses on young adults. And so here are some quotes that sort of encapsulates that idea. He says, the potential for change is concentrated in the cohorts of young adults who are old enough to participate directly in the movements impelled by change, but not old enough to have become committed to an occupation, a residence, a family appropriation, or a way of life. A new cohort provides a market for radical ideas and a source of followers, and they are more likely than their elders to criticize the existing order. So in this paper, we examine young adults of the millennial generation, and the millennial generation is poised to incur significant social change given a number of unique set of attributes and characteristics. First, the millennial generation is the largest generation. It's over 75 million in the US, eclipsing the current size of the post-war baby boom generation. And so here's a pie chart showing, generated by William Frey of the Brookings Institute, showing the proportion of the 2019 US population by generation. And you see that the millennials encompass the largest percentage. And the cutoff points for what makes up the millennial generation is still up for debate. But generally speaking, prior work has established millennials as those born between 1981 and late 90s, early 2000s. The other generations that are shown here in this pie chart include the pre-boomer generation, or sometimes known as the silent generation. These are folks born before 1945. The baby boomers born between 46, 64. Gen Xers born between 65, 80. Gen Z, which is sort of late 90s, early 2000s, and approximately 2012. and then the post-Gen Z generation, 2013 and after. So think about where you were born and sort of, do you think you fit in that generation? I'm part of the millennial generation, but just right at the cutoff. So I don't necessarily agree I'm part of that generation, but that's what the prior scholarship has established. So in addition to being the largest generation, what's unique about the millennials is that it's received a lot of media coverage that has forged very strong stereotypes about this generation. And so here are just some photos I've grabbed that depict many of these stereotypes. For example, millennials are often stereotyped or characterized as very self-absorbed. They've been labeled, their generation's been labeled the selfie generation or Generation Me. Millennials are the first generation to enter young adulthood with incredible access to various forms of technology, laptops, smart cell phones, tablets, and so forth. And the first generation to enter young adulthood with social media being a large presence, whether it be YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. In the top left corner, you see a magazine cover of The New Yorker depicting another stereotype of millennials, which is that they're protected and coddled. And here is a millennial hanging up his newly minted PhD in his child bedroom, sort of moving back in with his parents. And you can see in the background there, his parents are looking concerned that their child is coming back after earning his PhD, living in their home. Another key factor that separates millennials from prior generations is their unique set of socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. And part of why that's the case is that millennials entered college, were in college, graduated college, entered the workforce, entered the housing market during the Great Recession in the late 2000s, which significantly impacted their job prospects, housing opportunities, or family status. And that's sort of borne out in the data. And so here is a bar graph provided by or put together by the Pew Research Center, showing the percentage of young adults, defined here as 25 to 37, living in their parental home across generations and by educational category. And here, millennials, across all educational categories, millennials appear to be more likely to be still living with their parents. In particular, millennials without a bachelor's degree is much more significantly likely to be living at home. Here's a dot plot showing that millennials are also less likely to be married during young adulthood than previous generations. In 2018, 46% of millennial young adults were married, compared to 57% for Gen Xers, and it increases thereafter. And so scholarship has shown that across a number of different economic and demographic characteristics, millennials are relatively unique compared to prior generations. They're more likely to achieve a college degree, live below the poverty line, carry financial debt, live in an urban area. They're less likely to own a car or a home during young adulthood, live in dense housing. They're more likely to be foreign-born, interracial, marry across race, ethnicity, and speak a language other than English at home. What scholarship has emphasized in particular in distinguishing millennials from prior generation is its significant racial and ethnic diversity. So here are age pyramids showing the distribution of the population, US population in 1980 and 2015, stratified by white versus minority or non-white, and highlighted the young adults, the baby boomers in 1980 and the millennials in 2015. And millennials as young adults in 2015 are much more significantly likely to be non-white compared to their baby boomer young adult counterparts in 1980. Specifically, millennials are approximately 56% white in 2015. In 1980, when occupied by the baby boomers, young adults were 78% white. And so the large waves of immigration to the US in the 1980s and 1990s, especially from Latin America and Asia, coupled with the aging population of the white population, made millennials a far more racially and ethnically diverse generation than any that preceded it. While millennials are distinct across a variety of demographic traits compared to earlier generations, it is their unique values and preferences that have received considerable attention. Millennials are often portrayed in popular media as progressive and socially liberal, and survey results from the Pew Research Center have found evidence for this greater broad-mindedness and tolerance. So here is a stacked bar chart showing that millennials are the only generation in which a majority holds consistently liberal and mostly liberal positions across different social issues. And that gap between millennials and other generations have increased as millennials have transitioned into young adulthood. And other survey results indicate a very progressive or more progressive viewpoints. Millennials are more likely to support abortion, climate change legislation, marijuana legalization, same-sex marriage, universal health care, gun ownership restrictions, immigration, and the use of gender-neutral pronouns. And so because of these socially progressive viewpoints, the millennial generation has been described by the demographer William Frey as a bridge that may close the racial and cultural generation gap that, as recent politics have shown, is dividing the nation. So most notable for the purposes of this present paper that I'm showcasing today is the significant gap between millennials and prior generations in their attitude towards race and ethnicity. So here is a bar graph showing that millennials are more likely to report that the US needs to continue making changes to give Blacks equal rights with whites. And that's true not only for the entire millennial cohort, but also as well as if you focus on white millennials, and even the case of white conservative millennials. Here's a line graph showing that millennials across time have persistently presented or stated that they think racial discrimination is the main reason why many Black people can't get ahead these days. And that gap between them and the other generations have only increased as millennials have transitioned into young adulthood. Even amongst self-reported conservatives, just across the board, millennials are just more likely than prior generations to agree that Blacks are just treated less fairly than whites. And some have argued that these progressive attitudes towards race, ethnicity, the overall liberal perspectives on many social and political issues signal optimism for a social change agenda that promotes inclusion and reductions in racial and ethnic inequality. So an important sign of decreased racial inequality is decreased residential segregation. And so the separation of where people live by race and ethnicity is an enduring feature of the American metropolitan landscape. Since peak segregation in the 1960s, Black-white segregation has declined, but levels remain stubbornly high. And in the case of Hispanic white and Asian white segregation, it's remained stagnant, if not increasing. And so in this paper, we examine the types of neighborhoods that millennial young adults are living in. Specifically, are they more diverse and less segregated compared to prior generations? So one hypothesis is that they are living in less segregated neighborhoods. Two main factors that might support this hypothesis or this prediction are their unique demographic traits. They are large, racially diverse, interracial, and they're more likely to marry across race, ethnicity. It also could be a case of preferences. Perhaps millennials are just more likely to be more open to living in neighborhoods that are more racially diverse or encompass residents that are not of their own same race, ethnicity. However, you can also hypothesize that millennials are living in equally or potentially even more segregated neighborhoods. So one of the factors that might contribute to that is that although they state progressive viewpoints, although they say they support certain legislation or certain factors when it comes to racial inequality, when you look at their actions in terms of their moving behavior, they still follow patterns of historical segregation. In particular, prior research has shown that white residential preferences typically are sort of motivating or are important factors for segregation in the United States. They're far less likely than their minority counterparts to express a preference for living in racially mixed neighborhoods or environments. And a lot of that is drawn from the minority group threat hypothesis or theory that states that if a certain threshold of non-whites are living in the neighborhood, whites tend to move out and concentrate elsewhere. But it also could be an economic reason. Prior work has shown that income and wealth gaps by race and ethnicity are actually higher for millennials relative to prior generations. And so it could be an economic factor that might still persist segregation patterns for these young adult millennials. One thing I should note that is that the millennial generation, as I defined it, is a pretty large period there, almost a 20-year period. And so there might be differences as it relates to early versus late millennials, especially when you think about when each of these experienced the Great Recession, which was once again a very important part of why millennials are quite distinct from prior generations. Yes.
A question about the income and wealth gaps by race and ethnicity. Is that a cohort effect, or have folks been able to tease that out from essentially the Great effect that across all groups we're seeing wider gaps in income?
I think based on what I've read and the research I've read, it is a cohort effect. Yes, there is a combination of the two, and it's difficult to tease those out. But in comparison, if you look at different age groups, the comparison point is young adults, millennials compared to Gen X when they were young adults, compared to baby boomers when they're young adults, right? So gaps are larger. But also, if you look at other age groups, I think they are to some degree larger, but not quite as large as the young adult. Okay, so now I'll get to the actual study itself. So in the study, we are comparing neighborhood diversity and segregation levels of young adults. Here we define young adults as those between the ages of 25 and 29, and I'll get to why we use that age restriction. We draw on data from the decennial census, 1990, 2000, 2010, and 5-year estimates from the American Community Survey, 2015-19. And we link the generation that were young adults in each of these decennial census and ACS years. Specifically, in 1990, young adults were the late boomers. 2000, they were the Gen Xers. 2010 are the early millennials, and 2019 are the late millennials. And our definition of neighborhood here are census tracts normalized to 2010 boundaries. And we're looking only at neighborhoods that are within metropolitan statistical areas based on 2010 definitions.
You were talking before about how millennials are living with their parents. Are you looking only at millennials not living with their parents, or are you mixing them?
Mixing them, so I'm not separating the two.
What fraction live with their parents approximately, you said?
I don't have the, let's see, what was that? It was separated by education category. So
Okay.
it was like 10%, 15, 21, I think, by the different
Okay.
categories. Yeah. And that was between 25 to 37. So a larger age period than.
Can you? Yeah.
So then that's a good segue. So why 25 to 29? And the reason why mainly is because we wanted to try to mitigate or minimize any spillover from other generations. This is a table showing the generations and the ages that each generation was in during the 1990 to 2009 years that we're looking at, and highlighted are the generations that were 25 to 29 in each of those years. And so if you go down below 25, if you go up 29, above 29, you start to spill over into other generations, right? And so Gen Xers and millennials might get grouped together if you start expanding that, say in 2000 or 2010. So we chose this relatively limited age period or age window to try to contaminate or try to mitigate any contamination or spillover across generations. So our analysis starts at the very local level, looking at neighborhood diversity. And so here, neighborhood diversity is measured using the entropy index, which is given in the equation above here. In the equation, Q subscript R refers to the racial group's R proportion of a neighborhood population. And here I use 5 race ethnic groups: Hispanic and non-Hispanic, white, Black, Asian, and other. The formula sets the maximum of value of E to the natural log of the number of groups, so in this case 5. And so a larger value indicates a greater neighborhood diversity, and a lower value, of course, indicates low diversity. So a value of 0 means that this neighborhood is occupied by a single race ethnic group. A value of 100 indicates that all 5 groups are equally represented in that neighborhood. So what we do first is we conduct a set of fixed effects multivariate regression models, where we're looking at the association between neighborhood diversity and young adult composition using this equation shown here. The outcome here of interest is the diversity of tract J and MSAK at year T.
Could you just highlight with your mouse which one you're talking about?
Yes. So outcome,
The diversity just for that age group or across the whole population?
the entire population in that neighborhood, yes, not the age group.
So, diversity of the entire population.
Yes. So yes, so the outcome is for the entire population in the neighborhood, but the main independent variable, which is the P here, subscript T, J, K, is the percentage of residents that are young adults. So it's basically, what is the association? So this alpha value is increase the percentage of residents by 1 percentage point. How much does that increase the neighborhood diversity? Or what's the association in the increase of neighborhood diversity? We also include in this model a set of tract level controls like log population size, percent of residents that have a college degree, percent poverty. We also include year fixed effects, MSA fixed effects, and MSA specific linear time trend to control for sort of larger secular trends that are occurring, in particular, if there's large scale trends of decreasing segregation across time, across MSAs. And the main coefficient of interest is this lambda value, which is the interaction of the P, T, T, J, K, and the year dummy variables. And we estimate marginal effects of using this lambda to then look at the gaps in this association across generations.
Can you say something about, maybe following on Claude's question, why the unit is the tract as opposed to the person? Why did you choose to do it this way? Is it some theoretical reason, or is it just convenient, or are those two actually not as different as I think they would be? Or
That's a good question. A good point. It's more out of convenience to get a larger sort of representative sample of young adults. So the individual data, unless I have census restricted access, which I don't, unfortunately, I'd rely on like IPM's data, and IPM's data doesn't have census tract level, so I'd have to use something larger like a Puma, which I'm not really comfortable using as a representative of a neighborhood.
But should our interpretation be about what is the effect on millennials on tract diversity, or should our interpretation how do the tracts that generations have lived in when they're 20 to 25 differ over time, or are those the same thing?
Are you thinking like the outcome and the P
Well, your
switching?
motivation was all about the individuals. Are they living in more? But this looks, at least superficially, like it's the cost. It's what determines tract diversity. But maybe I'm misinterpreting the
Yeah,
regression.
yeah. Well, I try not to. I'm not making any causal
Yeah.
statements. It's more of just an association. So I guess it's the way I look at it is, if this neighborhood has 50% young adults, right? How does that compare in neighborhood diversity levels in a neighborhood that say has 55% or 60%? And so are there differences in diversity across those different neighborhoods based on the composition of young adults in that neighborhood?
But follow up Josh's point, there's implication that if you plop a bunch of young people into a neighborhood, it changes the diversity, not only in the building they're living in, but the population around them.
Yes. Okay, so that's so this is at starting at the local scale, looking at the neighborhood, which we define as a census tract. But this neighborhood diversity is not referred to as a measure of segregation because it doesn't measure the distribution of race, ethnic groups across any sort of space. And so we then transition, sort of moving up to the geographic scale, and measure residential segregation at the MSA level, which is sort of the common approach in demographic and sociological literature for examining segregation. And so here we calculate the Thiel's index H, and the Thiel's index actually draws from the entropy neighborhood level entropy index, which we calculate for each neighborhood for our sample. And so H takes on the following formula here. It's basically how much does each neighborhood's diversity diverges from the overall diversity in the metro area. So capital T here is the total population in MSA. T subscript J is the total population in the tract. E subscript J is the diversity in the neighborhood. And capital E without the subscript is the diversity in the metro area. And so H is a structural measure of segregation that captures how evenly racial ethnic groups are distributed among neighborhoods within the MSA. A value of 0 would indicate no segregation, and a value of 1 would represent maximum segregation. So it's the inverse of the neighborhood diversity, whereas higher values on diversity indicates greater diversity. And so here we calculate 2 group measures of evenness, the segregation of whites from other groups. So specifically, what we're capturing here with this measure is we're measuring residual segregation of non-Hispanic white young adults from 2 sets of groups. First, in relation to the total population of Black, Asian, Hispanic, non-white. So segregation of white young adults from the total across all ages, Black, Asian, Hispanic, non-white. Second set of measures look at segregation of white young adults from their same age group peers. In this case, young adults that are non-whites and young adults that are Hispanics, right? And so you might be thinking, well, why don't you look at Black or Asian young adults? Unfortunately, that data is not available for any year, at least in the public domain, for any year. And so we can't calculate those specific variables, at least at the tract level. They're available at county, state, and so forth. But at the tract level, Black, Asian, and other sort of race ethnic groups are not captured with the age-specific measures. Furthermore, age-specific race ethnicity data are not available in 1990, only available in 2000, 2010, 2019. So we can't make comparisons to the young adult baby boomers, late baby boomers. And as a point of comparison, we make comparisons of the segregation measures to 35 to 44-year-olds and 45 to 64-year-olds. So not just looking at the young adults, but looking at older age groups as a point of comparison. Final thing, in terms of the sample restrictions, like what exactly is in our universe of data here that we're looking at. Census tracts only located within large MSAs relative to each race ethnic group because of the sensitivity of these segregation measures based on the size of these groups. We only include census tracts with that have relatively large populations, 500 in all years, less than 50% of residents living in a group quarter. So that's like military barracks, university dorms, and so forth. And are not missing data for any of the years. So this yields a final analytic sample of approximately 52,000 tracts located within 200 MSAs. All right, so now first set of results. We're looking at neighborhood diversity, starting at the lowest scale. These are coefficients from those fixed effects models that I talked about a little bit earlier. And I highlight here in red the models that focus on the composition of young adults, 25 to 29. And the coefficients here are represented as marginal effects. And so we find that across all generations, the coefficients are positive, which means a greater percent presence of young adults is associated with a higher level of neighborhood diversity. However, if you look at the effect sizes or the magnitude of these coefficients, you'll find that independent chi-square tests looking at these 3 coefficients. So once again, 1990 are the late baby boomers, 2000 Gen Xers, 2010 are the early millennials. These are all not statistically significant from one another. However, in 2019, which are the late millennials, this coefficient of 0.47, which is about half of the early millennials and about a third from the other generations, that is significantly lower. So in this case, it suggests that neighborhood diversity for the late millennials, although positive still, is less strongly associated with neighborhood diversity relative to the prior generations. I'll briefly for the sake of time, I probably won't talk too much about the rest of the age groups.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes.
Yeah, so I won't. If you're curious about these other age groups, I can sort of talk about it in the Q&A. Just sort of showing what I just said graphically. This on the y-axis shows the predicted neighborhood diversity levels. On the x-axis is percent young adult composition in the neighborhood. And the separate lines are the different generations. And as you can see, going left to right, we see that the slope is positive, it's going up, but the slope for the late millennials 2019 is flatter than the other three generations. Okay, so this set of results hones in not on just the total young adult population, but in particular the white young adult population. So just replace what I showed earlier in the tables, instead of total young adults, white young adults. And so, and once again, I don't have 1990 because age-specific data are not available in 1990, only 2000 and after. And coefficients here, once again, are still positive, right? A greater presence of white young adults in the neighborhood is associated with higher levels of neighborhood diversity. But we see a similar trend in that the late millennials, their association is much smaller relative to early millennials, and in this case, the Gen Xers. And that showed once again in these predicted plots of neighborhood diversity across percent white young adults for each generation. Left to right, positive, upward sloping, but the late millennials are flatter. Okay, so that is neighborhood diversity. What about if we go up the geographic scale and look at segregation for the MSAs? And so here are the first set of results showing segregation of white young adults from total non-white, Hispanic, Black, and Asian. Y-axis are the teal index, the predicted teal indices, and then x-axis are the different generations, 2000 and 2019. And for the most part, if you look at just the general trend, we find that if you go from Gen Xers to early millennials, we see either a dip or it remains sort of similar or the same across all different population groups, right? Non-white, Hispanic, Black, Asian. But then when we go to the late millennials, we actually see an increase. It goes sort of back up. And in the case of the Hispanic and Asian groups, segregation levels are actually higher relative to the Gen Xers. So this very much fortifies or supports the neighborhood diversity results, in that the late millennials seem to be unique in that their segregation levels are bumping back up. Very briefly, 35-44. I know I said I wouldn't talk about these age groups, but very briefly, they follow similar trends: a slight decrease 2010, upward increase in 2019. The main point is that that upward increase in 2019 is nowhere as pronounced as it is for the 25 to 29-year-olds. What about the age-specific neighborhood racial segregation? What about comparing white young adults to their non-white and Hispanic peers? And so here we find similar trends, right? A dip down in 2010 for the early millennials. So white young adults are less segregated to non-white young adults and Hispanic young adults in 2010, but then an increase back up in 2019 for the late millennials. And in this case, this increase is higher than compared to the Gen Xers. For the other age groups, similar finding, trend downwards 2010, slightly upwards in 2019, but nowhere as pronounced as for the 25 to 29-year-olds. Okay, good timing, right?
Perfect, yeah.
Wonderful. So let me summarize the findings in relation to the main research questions that were posed in this study. So are millennials more or less segregated compared to prior generations? It appears that they are more segregated compared to prior generations. White young adults are segregated from total Black, Asian, Hispanic, and non-white. And when you look at their age group peers, non-white and Hispanic. But there are differences between early and late millennials. When you compare 2010, which are the early millennials, their segregation levels are actually equal, if not lower, compared to Gen Xers. But 2019, which are the late millennials, those segregation levels go back up, and in some cases are up to the point where they surpass the Gen Xers in terms of their segregation. What's notable, and I didn't really emphasize this, but I'll emphasize it here, white segregation from Hispanic and white was particularly pronounced in 2019. So for example, let me just go back here. For example, here, white 25 to 29-year-olds with the total Asian population remained stagnant 2000 2010 and a big increase in 2019. Same thing with Hispanic, right? Whereas the Black population, there is of course an increase, but not as quite as pronounced as we see with the Hispanic and Asian populations. So the question then is why is that the case? And we don't answer that in the study, but focusing on the diversity measure that we look at, so looking at the local scale, very similar results, right? They're living, even though young adults are associated with greater diversity at the neighborhood level, there are differences between early and late. The late millennials are the association is less strong or less pronounced compared to early millennials and Gen Xers. And in terms of future questions that are coming out of this research, things that me and my co-author are sort of thinking about, what about Black, Hispanic, Asian young adult specific segregation patterns, right? The focus here was white young adults. How segregated are they from the total Black, white, non-white population? What about these age-specific young adults, these Black, Hispanic, and Asian? Do they follow the similar segregation patterns? What are some of the macro structural and social influences explaining these diverging patterns? We don't talk about any causes. We don't talk about what might be driving these potential differences. In particular, when you compare the late versus the early millennials. Here, I just give an example of the experience of the Great Recession and the housing crisis in the late 2000s. That likely affected more pronouncedly those in that earlier millennial cohort. And as I mentioned, the pronounced increase in Hispanic and Asian segregation, what are some key drivers that might be underlying that pattern? And then thinking about the implications, right? What are the housing, social, political, and economic implications of this increasing segregation amongst young adults? And then tracking these young adults as they age. Do we see these similar segregation patterns as millennials age into later adulthood, when you start forming families, when you start buying houses, when you start getting more established in your careers and are becoming less mobile? So I thank everyone for your time and patience, and I look forward to any questions, reactions, feedback.
Great. Thank you so much, Noli. After being mean to the Zoom audience, I think we'll start with a question. I think Gretchen had a question. Gretchen, do you just want to say your question out loud?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect.
Okay, thanks. So I think Josh brought up earlier that that millennials, a lot of them moved back in with family during different parts of the housing crisis. Certainly, we saw a lot of this with younger people in COVID. And I mean, just sort of in terms of the methodology, is there any way you could peg how much of this increase to 2019 comes from millennials moving in with their older gen parents? Say the older gen parents live in more segregated neighborhoods, and then if a lot of younger people move in with them, how much is that sort of driving what you see?
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Gretchen, for that wonderful question. And that's something that we've thought about. And one of the reasons why I emphasize in that magazine cover from the New Yorker that is something that is definitely prevalent and present, especially when you're looking at the earlier millennials, when they were much more impacted by the recession. I think in terms of data, it's a little bit difficult because that would sort of reduce the sample size even further, but even just restrictions to what I have access to. I mean, if you're looking at it from the neighborhood diversity, that model, we do have neighborhood measures of sort of family structure within a household. And so, we could sort of tackle it from that way, but we don't have age specific, whether it's, 25 or 29-year-olds or, older or younger. But that could be a measure we can introduce. At the larger scale, the segregation levels, it's just harder in terms of access to data. So I think that requires a more an individual level analysis as opposed to the ecological analysis that Jen and I are doing in this paper, other than potentially including that control in the neighborhood model. But if anyone here has any insight or recommendations, because it is something that Jen and I have been thinking about, and obviously Josh and Gretchen sort of bringing it up, is probably an important factor to consider or take into account.
We just like the New York, that's the cover. That's why we stuck on for it.
I know, yeah. They're all
It may or may not
PhDs.
be an important thing, but I think we're asking it because that like, stuck out for us.
Yeah.
Does ACS, obviously hard for the comparisons, but you have the long form censuses, pretty big samples released. ACS tract level, very small. I think 5-year summary files.
Mhm.
So maybe you can't do your whole analysis, but you could look at a couple of these
Mhm.
questions with the public ACS data.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe this is completely dumb, but I mean, if you just sort of ran the analysis based on only on one person households, I mean, I don't know if that would help you at all, but it would sort of, if you saw the same thing for only one person households, people living by themselves, then that would at least indicate that this wasn't just, some structural change in how people were agglomerating in households. And now I'll be quiet because you guys are all actually there. Thank you. Bye.
Well, thank you for that recommendation. I think the problem is like the data. So that would require one person households that are also 25 to 29. And that kind of data at that's such a local level, the tract is just not available publicly. So I think that's the difficulty that Jen and I are sort of tackling with this paper. And it might provoke us to do that individual level analysis, whether it's going to the PSID, for example, which has that kind of information, the restricted PSID, or doing something with the restricted census. So I think it's something that we're thinking about and try to incorporate. And I thank everyone here for sort of prodding us even further with that point.
So I think we had another question from Zoom, which was Ken. I think something about mobility in general. Is that your question, Ken?
Well, your measurements are restricted to tracts in metropolitan statistical areas, as I understand it. And there's also a movement out of metropolitan areas into more rural areas and less concentrated density states. I wonder if you could just say a little about how you see that affecting the broader picture.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good point. I'm trying to think. I'm an urban scholar, so I'm dipping into an area that I'm not super familiar with in terms of looking at sort of non-urban sort of metro measures of segregation. Because the metro areas typically would encompass both urban and suburban, so I'm sort of capturing that spectrum. It's more on the rural spectrum that I'm thinking of. Yeah, I can't really say too much about what's happening in the rural sense here in terms of like what millennials might look like there. I imagine that mobility is certainly a factor. If you're cutting across different areas of that urban to suburban to rural spectrum, and that might impact sort of the segregation levels within the metro and across the metros. But I can't really speak to what millennials, young adults, and that rural interaction, what that might look like.
Claude?
Yeah, I'd like to talk a bit about the conceptual framework before
Sure.
hard data stuff. It seems to me that without being explicit, but perhaps you should be explicit, this is a selection process. The question is, why are these people selecting themselves into these neighborhoods?
Mhm.
It's hard to imagine a model which says that the presence of, you could build one, but the presence of young adults drives the racial mix in the neighborhood, other than the numbers they bring themselves.
Mm.
So I think mostly what we're talking about is why is the pattern, the housing pattern chosen by or selected by this group changing or not changing over time? And I think it'd be important to sort of work out, what your story is. That and then it seems to me that there are at least two things going on at the same time. One is there's something about this generation that's different. And we know they get married later. We know their economic situation is worse. They're more highly educated. And then there's something happening in the neighborhoods. And your results are a combination. And what do we know that's happening in the neighborhoods? Well, we know, for example, that even within metro areas, there's been a great reduction in the proportion of Black in the center city in a lot of these areas. True Berkeley, true Oakland. And except in places perhaps where that's had high Hispanic immigration, though a lot of the Hispanic flow has been to the suburbs, and a lot of the Asian flow has been to the suburbs. There are fewer, the argument could be that there are fewer diverse neighborhoods in which to select yourself if you are a white young adult. So I think at the conceptual level, you have this, I think it's a challenge to think about the changes going on in the neighborhoods, and including their housing stock and so forth, and the changes in this generation. But I do think I'd step back from the data. I think hard about that. And the last thing I'll say is one distinction of the millennial generation is the extent to which increasingly having a graduate degree is very faithful for all sorts of other outcomes.
Mhm.
And so it's really, if you're talking about the young adults moving as roommates into condos south of Market, that's one model. The other model is, and these are the college graduate ones, young adults without a high school degree staying at home with their parents in the rural areas of Kentucky.
Mhm.
The dynamics are all different. Again, I think it's important to think out the story here before before the data.
Yeah, so thank you for that point and sort of pushing that there. I think that the story certainly needs to be clarified, and I think we were sort of thinking about it from both the sheer sort of racial diversity of this generation, but of course that interacts with the lesser number of neighborhoods that people have options to in terms of diversity, the spectrum of diversity. But we were thinking more of the story being more of a preferences story, with the idea that there's been a lot of sort of talk about millennials being very open-minded and very sort of liberal and very progressive, and they support racial equality.
But doesn't your model have this fixed time effects in it anyway? So you're kind of maybe not fully accounting for it, but you're trying to. Your modeling is doing what you're saying. I think maybe not.
Here's a story, for example, a very common story told by sociologists of gentrification. The first whites who moved into what was previously a low-income ethnic neighborhood, they talk about how wonderful it is to move into a diverse neighborhood.
Mhm.
Because 10 years later, the neighborhood is all young white adults, and where's the diversity? Diversity is gone.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's a storyline that would explain, for instance, the gross results, which is early millennials versus late millennials.
Yeah, and that really sort of overlaps with some research I didn't present here, where they looked at young adult patterns in terms of living in suburban versus essential cities. And they found that more recent millennials are actually, earlier millennials were concentrating in these sort of central city neighborhoods. They didn't point to the attributes of these neighborhoods, but they could be sort of in a form of gentrification that's happening. They're sort of picking these neighborhoods because they're hip or they're like in the upswing. And those neighborhoods typically are still not fully gentrified. They're in the process of being gentrified. And so that could be an explanatory story. But I mean, what do you think about that preferences story though? Because I think that is sort of what we're trying to drive at least in the paper that we're currently examining. Because the models of what explains segregation are the economic model versus sort of the preferences model. And we sort of focus more on the preferences with that story of millennials are open-minded, they tend to be more likely to support racial equality and so forth.
I'm going to leave that question to the for later, because we have a question. A remaining question is from one of our first year students. Go for it, Dan.
Oh, actually, that was.
Okay, so echo in and just say what you're going to say.
Oh, I was gonna ask about gentrification and whether, like, since early millennials, exactly what we were just talking about, where early millennials, were moving into more diverse neighborhoods or diverse neighborhoods, and then later millennials, were moving into more segregated neighborhoods. I was wondering if the later millennials were following the earlier millennials to what were previously diverse neighborhoods, but then has become more and more gentrified. But that was what you guys were kind of touching on right now.
Yeah, and more recent scholarship has shown that young adults have tended to move into these central city neighborhoods, but that sort of back to city movement has been diminished over the last couple of years. And a lot of them are sort of moving back out to the suburbs within the last like two to 5 years. And so there's a strong push of young adults moving in to the central city, sort of part of the creative class and sort of part of the whole hip neighborhoods within the city, amenities for young adults. That's been sort of declining over the last 5 years or so. And there's some evidence that there's some movement out of these central city neighborhoods going back into the suburbs.
Is that because of COVID partially, or?
Yeah, it could be. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay, let's do one last question. I'm happy to.
Well, I was just gonna say, this really begs for an individual level, preference-based model where you're specifying preferences. You're running discrete choice models, a function of the attributes, where you're controlling for the economic factors that you're trying to argue are not driving this, and at a very detailed level. And then you can try to get at some of these other factors where you're also looking at the neighborhood characteristics using a leave one out kind of measurement. So you're not including the characteristics of the cohort as you're measuring the neighborhood characteristics. So I would just turn to that discrete choice literature. I think that will go much farther. The last thing I was going to say, I love, and maybe we don't have time, but I'm still trying to understand the magnitudes here. And you have massive samples, so if you're saying they're statistically significant, but I was trying to just look at those graphs. Is this really a huge difference, or is this sort of reading tea leaves right now? And I couldn't tell by your specifications.
And that's good.
But am I right in saying that talk is cheap in some sense? That the talk is very different for this new generation, but the living patterns, if anything, are going the other direction. Maybe the changes are small, but they're not. It's not a dramatically different situation. Maybe I'm just being hard on my kids, but this is not the expectation from your introduction was that this group would live in a dramatically less segregated environment, and that's clearly not the case. If anything, it's more segregated. It may be a little bit, it may be a lot. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, there's scouring the media, press, popular press, but even scholarship from William Frey, labeled this millennial generation as a bridge to diversity. So I think that sort of conveys an idea that this is a significant generation, and even if the effects are not as quite substantial, so I guess the small effect, or even the null, is still a story in and of itself, given the story of this should be a significant generation.
Okay, let's thank Noli so much. I think meeting with students, and then we're going to go off to lunch for our first live lunch in
All right.
this last.
Thank you.